Welcome to the 387th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, KAIST. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today is a very special episode of COVID calls. I'm joined by three students of KAIST, Sung-chan Choi, Junha Yoon, and Jaehoon Kim for a group discussion on COVID-19 in Korea. And I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about this episode. The three students are going to be actually asking me some questions about COVID calls and about my life during COVID. And then I'm also going to ask them questions. So I'm just having a moment of a technical difficulty there. I think we're okay now. And I'll be asking them questions as well. And then we'll have an open conversation. So I'm going to take this opportunity here at the start of the program to invite the students to introduce themselves. And I'd like to start with Sung-chan.
Okay, it is very interesting time for all of us. My name is Sung-chan Cho, who is studying at the KAIST about the major in scope computing, but also taking the minor course in STP. So it's very interesting and also unusual time for us. Thanks for joining our interview, Professor.
Thank you, Sung-chan. And Junha Yoon, could you introduce yourself, please?
Okay, I'm the student of the KAIST as well as Sung-chan, and I'm currently majoring the electrical engineering, and I'm also minoring STP, Science, Technology, and Policy. And thank you for inviting us for this interview. And I think I can hold it well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we have a lot to discuss. Thank you. And last but not least, Jaehoon Kim, good to see you.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys. I'm Jaehoon Kim. Can you guys hear me, right? Yeah, I'm a student on Department of Chemistry. I'm very happy to join here your COVID calls. Like it have been most amount 400 episodes, right? It's so many. I hope you will continue those episodes until 1000.
Thank you for that wish. I appreciate that. And just to give the viewers just a little bit more context, these students are also students who are in a class that I had the great honor to teach this fall at KAIST Risk Society and Disaster Studies. And so we've been working together now for several months to explore the history and policy aspects of disaster. And this is part of a final project for them to be working on the creation of disaster archives. So with that, I want to just give a few more preliminary comments and then we'll turn to our conversation. Just a reminder, you can usually catch the COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern time and just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. Today is a special COVID calls episode at 5 p.m. Korea time. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can always keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, December 9th, 2021, there are 5,279,358 deaths globally from COVID-19. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. Presently, South Korea is reporting 3,957 total deaths COVID-19. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and we'd like to continue that now on COVID calls. And I'm going to invite Junha Yoon actually to give a presentation at this time. Junha?
Oh, thank you for getting me, Mike. And I just want to introduce you about the one obituary that projected by the Busan Ilbo, that is one newspaper company in Korea. And this is kind of the archive for that people who that died from the COVID-19. And well, I want to read it in Korean at first, and I just gonna summarize it in English after that. And so this is the episode where we are going to do, and you can also see in the chat box too where it is. And so let me gonna read it. So let's start from 누나만 찾다 하늘로 광주 891번 숫자로 남은 동생, which means that the victim was finding the sister and passed away, and he's died, and so he's treated as the 891 patient as the COVID-19. So this was kind of the obituary that we are going to remember the people who are patients of the COVID-19, not as the number, case number, but also who they really were. So I'm gonna read it Korean. 해군복 차림의 건장한 청년, 동생하면 떠오르는 모습이다. 김경숙 씨는 어머니가 쥐어준 동생 기련 씨의 사진을 오랫동안 간직하고 있었다. 너무 멋지다. 평생 바다에서 늙어라며 동생을 응원했던 김 씨. 동생은 그 말을 따르지 못했다. 사진은 사라졌고 거짓말처럼 동생은 누이 곁을 떠났다. 30대 때 대위 진급을 앞두고 전역한 기련 씨는 해군복이 참 어울렸다. 엄마 따라 하늘로 올 1월 어머니 장례를 치르고 광주에 내려오자 희소식이 기다리고 있었다. 동생 상태가 호전돼 응급중환자실에서 일반 중환자실로 옮긴다는 연락이었다. 광주의 한 요양원에서 지내던 동생은 지난해 12월 22일 코로나에 감염됐다. 광주 요양시설 첫 집단 발병이었다. 동생은 초기엔 다른 환자들에 비해 상태가 괜찮았다. 걸어서 구급차를 타고 병원으로 이송됐다. 그러나 폐에 물이 차 온몸에 호수를 5개에서 6개가량 달아야 했다. 고비를 넘긴 1월 19일 한 달여 만에 동생은 눈 깜빡임으로 누나와 대화를 나눴다. 다 나으면 맛있는 거 먹자. 동생은 고개를 끄덕였다. 엿새 뒤 상황이 다시 악화됐다. 간병인의 연락을 받고 급히 뛰어간 1월 25일 자정. 동생은 이미 손 쓸 수 없을 정도로 상태가 나빠져 있었다. 2번의 심정지가 왔다. 김 씨는 약물 투여와 CPR 동의서에 사인을 하며 중환자실 입구에서 밤을 지새웠다. 7시간 뒤 사망 선고를 하려는 의사를 따라 비로소 동생을 만날 수 있었다. 방호복으로 중무장한 채였다. So this was the first part of this obituary named late Farrell, and you can see the more story about the patients and his family, then how they have to make the pass away of the one whose name is Kil-hyun. And so this try to remember who died in the COVID-19 situation. Then so you might not be understand Korean. So this was the kind of who was the that person, and how are their families are doing, and also that what they want for the COVID-19 care, because they treat the most of newspapers and medias and other doctors are treat the people who died from COVID as the number, that what case that he was how the numbering them. So he's 891, 91st the patient of the COVID-19. So these kind of things are handling by this newspaper company, and you can see the more patient story than how people died and what is their background story and what is they want to the other people or the government, how to treat them. You can see the things like there. Okay, so thank you for listening to my obituary presentation.
Junhai, thank you for reading that, and thank you for reading it in Korean, and also for translating the meaning for us in English as well. Just to get a little more context, is it not been conventional to have obituaries for COVID sufferers, those who've died of COVID, in Korean newspapers? You haven't seen that very much?
Yes, I think we don't have seen that very much because, as you know, Korea was controlling very in highly distancing, so there were not much the COVID death cases in Korea, and so at first it was kind of seemed the COVID patients as a criminal, so it's their fault to be the COVID victim. So that's one reason I think that Korea did not help in the obituary for people.
Let me invite Sungchan and Jaehoon. Any thoughts or comments about what Junha was reading about this special project coming out of Busan?
For me, actually, before looking about the disaster archiving, I didn't really know about the obituary in worldwide, how they think and then how they use for it. So in Korea, maybe we have a very little position of the obituary culture, but I hope it is one of the good or nice way to be memorized and share with the memory from our community. It's one of the good way, and we have to learn and the part of it. That's what I think of it.
Jaehoon, let me invite you in. Any thoughts on this? And I'm particularly interested in this idea that there was stigma attached somehow to dying from COVID in South Korea.
In my opinion, I thought that the major some newspapers or those companies doesn't actually share the obituary. They also they just share how many people are dead by COVID and those like impact topics, like no any special events for individuals. And also I also just read this obituary it's the first time to me to read those obituary, and I think those articles might should share for our people a lot more to like feel and to understand their feelings, the victims' feelings.
Mhm. Is it part of is this part of a sort of sense of privacy around death and families more generally in Korea, that it's not generally done to share this kind of information about a loved one after they've died in a newspaper? And I ask this because as a faculty member of KAIST, I regularly get emails from faculty members in departments, people I've never met before, in which they're actually asking for blessings for a member of their family who's died. So I never experienced that in the United States. That's a form of sharing that it's very personal that I'd never experienced. But then the obituary culture in the United States is very deep. I mean, there's pages and pages in newspapers historically full of obituaries. It seems quite different here in Korea. Jaehoon, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
I think it's the difference of Western culture and Eastern culture. So I also explained these points in the class, the Scott professor running. I think the culture difference, the main point is about thinking about individuals more, or think about family or the group people more. In Asia, especially Korea, I think we are thinking about more group activities, like more hanging out with people and more thinking more about the reacts with some others, not for our personal life. That's why those emails from the faculty members wanting to bless someone else, I think those are good events, like make people happy. But in the other hand, the obituary, some things are quite sad events, and I think people don't want to try to see those things for their own. Like it can happen. I just have to see when it came out in the news, but not for my own. I wouldn't find with my own.
Such interesting cultural comparisons there. Thank you. Junha, just to come back to you before we move on to the next part of our discussion, which is that right now, day by day, unfortunate records are being broken in South Korea. Numbers of deaths from COVID are higher than at any point in the pandemic. And I wonder if you think that somehow memorial culture will change as a result of that. Maybe not obituaries, because that doesn't seem to be, culturally the sort of normal way that memorial works. But I wonder if we may be in a moment of some sort of cultural shift, and with COVID being kind of at the center of that. What do you think, Junha?
There will be change, but I think it would be very difficult to we can see the confirmed patient as a kind of criminal, because in Korea, I think we still think that who get COVID-19 is their fault. So they giving some kind of damage to nearby people. So unless that problem solved, and I don't think that anything would be changed, in my opinion.
Wow. I just want to remind everybody that you're listening to COVID Calls. It's a special episode of COVID Calls in which my three guests are Junha Yoon, Sungchan Choi, and Jaehoon Kim, all students of KAIST. And I'm going to do something that haven't done much on COVID Calls. I'm going to surrender the microphone now to Sungchan, who's actually going to ask me some questions. And then after we talk a little bit, then we'll turn it around, and I'm going to have some questions for the students as well. So, Sungchan, we've had a few guest hosts on COVID Calls, and they're all brilliant people, and I'm glad to add you to that group, and as well Jaehoon and Junha as well. So I'll stop talking now.
oh my God, what should I say? But okay, so welcome to as a customer of the COVID Calls in 387 number. Thanks for joining our COVID Calls, Professor Gabriel Connolls. And our first question in our team was, it's very, very simple, but just for in case, where are you calling from and what is the pandemic situation there? Just for the listeners.
Right. So I'm in my office in the N4 building on the KAIST campus in Daejeon, South Korea. And the overall situation right now, I checked just before we got on, 7,100 cases, new cases of COVID-19 confirmed in South Korea yesterday. 57 deaths yesterday. So the trend lines.
Do you afraid of it or feel safety in Korea rather than USA? How you feel?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I have felt safe here throughout. Coming from the United States, which I did in February with my family, with my wife and my two sons. It was the first time when we left our house to go to the airport in New Jersey last February. It was the first time. I mean, we had been out of the house, but it's the first time we'd gone out and been in the airport. I mean, because the case rate there was so terrible and so scary, and no vaccination available at that time. Coming to Korea, a place that I had been following very closely in the news, felt like a refuge, frankly. And I would point out that among the statistics I just quoted you, it's also important to know that 80% of Koreans have now received 2 doses of vaccine. And that number in the United States right now, 60% of Americans. Now, overall, it's many more people, but as a percentage, there's 40% of Americans are unvaccinated. You're talking about 150 million people or so who are not vaccinated. So it's a really staggering number. So yeah, that's the situation where I'm calling from right now.
So you've come from the South Korea in this year, February, right? Correct, is it?
That's right.
Then is there any reason you came at KAIST as a professor while enduring anxiety in the COVID-19 situation? It might be not easy. Is there any special reason or whatever?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the job advertisement that first drew me to KAIST, to the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy, was first posted in the summer of 2019. So people who are not familiar with academia need to know that there are very few medieval institutions left in the world, but academia is one of those. Things move incredibly slowly and have their pace of doing things. But Yeah, the advertisement came up in the summer of 2019. I knew KAIST well because I had been here in 2017 and spent the summer here with my family as a guest of this department. At that time, I was researching the Sewol Ferry disaster with Professor Chiyoung John and a graduate student, Hyewon Kim. And we were interviewing commissioners and other staff members from the first Sewol Ferry Commission, which ended inconclusively. And so I already knew the department, and when the advertisement came up, I was thrilled to apply, but then it was a very long process. And I was here interviewing in December of 2019. And then I got on a plane and went home, and they said to me, well, of course, there's a process, and if it goes well, we might want to bring you back at some point in January or February 2020. And on the last day of 2019, the first COVID case was reported by the World Health Organization. And so the whole process slowed down.
So actually, the professor job opportunity was before the COVID-19 situation, actually.
Correct.
I got you.
And so the whole search process continued. I actually was afraid, I haven't really talked about this much, I was really afraid that KAIST was going to cancel the position because many universities in the United States did that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and because maybe they felt they needed to preserve money, or that they were worried that they wouldn't be able to carry out the search effectively, whatever it may be. So I started to see advertisements at Princeton and Harvard and other places canceling, and I thought, well, it was a nice dream, but it's not going to happen. And then I got a call saying, would you like to continue the interview process? And I'll never forget, I had an interview with KAIST upper administrators, and they were all around a table, all wearing a Zoom call, all wearing masks. And I was in my little home office in the corner where I always did COVID calls. I was dressed kind of like I am now. And it was the scariest moment, because usually in a job interview, you have an opportunity to read people's body language, and you can, you try to communicate who you are, both verbally and non-verbally. But it was just like staring at the
camera,
the
and
star
the
chamber. Yeah, exactly. And all of these august scientists and engineers are, they were very friendly, but of course, with a mask on, everybody looks a little bit like it's hard to read people, at that point. So anyway, that's how that unfolded. And then we moved here in February of 2020. February of 2021, this year. And moving in the middle of a pandemic, not something we had to do 2 weeks of quarantine when we arrived. And then I went straight to work as soon as I got out of quarantine.
Wow, it was very interesting whole story of how you get KAIST professor. Thanks for sharing your experience for us. So next, due to listening your story, I have my personal question for you. So moving your home and your family moving your home into South Korea due to the pandemic situation, is there any difficulty due to moving that period? Was there any difficulty?
I mean, it's a really good question. We couldn't say goodbye to people properly. And I was at Drexel University for 20 years. So I had some really deep relationships and friendships there. And I think you all haven't thought about this yet, but when you get to be, my age and you work in a place long enough, you think in the back of your mind, you think, if I ever leave, like, what is it? You go to retirement parties and you see how people say goodbye. And I had in my mind a certain picture of what, someday if I ever left Drexel, and I had you want to embrace people. And my colleagues did a beautiful thing. They sent cupcakes to my home on the day of a party, but it was on Zoom.
It was on Zoom. Oh my gosh.
I had former students, I had colleagues, and I sat there and my family got on, and I kind of sadly ate this cupcake while we said goodbye on Zoom, and that was hard. to say goodbye that way. In terms of the logistics of moving in the middle of a pandemic, as you could probably expect, the Korean government was pretty thorough. So I'll tell you one story. At that time, the United States was doing no track and trace, never has been really. And getting a COVID test was very hard to do. Only over that winter were the tests more available. And the Korean government stipulated that you had to have a negative COVID test within 72 hours of getting on a plane. Well, the way things work in the United States, you could get a test, but then they would give you a window of time in which you would get your results. And that window of time could be as much as 3 days. So we're trying to figure, okay, we're going to get on a flight. We got to get our tests, but we have to make sure we get our results within 3 days that the government of Korea requires, but we can't say specifically when we will get the result. And then there was a blizzard. And so the flight changed. And so everything is moving and changing. And my wife and I, it was almost like, having hourly updates and had calculators out and trying to figure out, well, what time of the day should we get a test and this? And my wife, who's more organized than I am, actually accomplished it. We ended up taking multiple COVID tests just so we would have one that was within the 72 hours. And at that time, I called the airport to ask if we couldn't get a COVID test, was there something else we could do? And they said, yes, you can get a COVID test at Newark International Airport. It costs $400 a person.
$400 per person?
Mm-hmm. So I was looking at potentially paying $1,600 US to get our COVID tests before we could come. But we were lucky. My wife managed it all, and we got our tests. And so those were the kind of difficulties that we faced. When we arrived, of course, we arrived in a very different COVID world. You get off the plane, they take your phone, they put the app on the phone for you while you stand there. We went through station after station after station, documents, stamping. It was, of course, we're jet lagged. And by the time we got to the end of it, we were here, we were cleared. And for 2 weeks, I got text messages every day from the Korean government asking me to take my temperature.
Was it suggested? The text was come by the English, or was it Korean?
Everything was in English.
Oh,
everything was translated.
That's much friendly.
Yeah, and I have to say also that my colleagues here in the department, students and faculty, and the staff of the international office here at KAIST, they were checking in on us constantly. So I was getting phone calls and Kakao messages and text messages, people checking on us and then asking if we needed any help. So I had an army of translators who were ready to help if we needed help in those.
That's very lucky.
And then people brought us food at the quarantine location. We were at an Airbnb, and I would get a call from a colleague. He would say, "Okay, we were there. Now we're gone. Come outside." And I'd go outside, and there would be a bag with food. And one of the students in the department brought us ice cream. We were treated really well. So I have no real complaints about that time, aside from being locked indoors for 2 weeks. But
Wow, it might be a very boring story, but I think that experience is quite unique because most of people never have chance to travel or move due to the pandemic situation. But however, you suffer almost like the immigration process, almost like not same as that. So it was quite unique and very, very useful to share all of us. So thanks for it. And my next question is, let me see, what might be good. So in the South Korea, in the KAIST, what are the challenges in teaching about disaster during a pandemic? Is there any special point due to the pandemic situation? Is there any more?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In terms of teaching, um, it's been quite extraordinary. I mean, students are just really switched on to this moment. I mean, it makes sense. People want to understand this world that they're living in. So I taught a graduate seminar in the spring when I first arrived about disasters, and then I had the chance to teach the class that all of us have taken together. Student interest has been extremely high. I mean, we're all doing this remotely, so our experiences, I think, well, we've done as well as we can. I think we've done pretty well. Our class had an opportunity to take a class trip to Ansan to see the Sewol Ferry Memorial and meet Sewol family members. That was really special for me at a variety of levels, in part just to go to Ansan, but also to be with you all. Because when you're a teacher and you're used to being with students all the time, that energy is something you come to rely on. And Zoom doesn't always quite cut it to create. We do our best, but so that's been a bit of a challenge. But that's a challenge that every teacher and every student has dealt with in this time. Um, I don't want to necessarily give an advertisement for disaster studies, but why not? I think it's a field that it's sad that it's relevant, but I can't think of many fields that are. I wish there were more people coming into this area of research. I think we need a lot more researchers in this space to understand the many different things that are happening to us every day. I mean, even just considering what's happened in South Korea in the last month, that the government felt compelled to move forward with Corona strategy, opening up, letting people congregate in larger numbers. We need to have a better understanding of why the government thought that was a good idea, and how will they react now with these case rates going up so dramatically. It looks like they're going to close back down. Questions about why vaccines have not been made available to the 5 to 11 age group in Korea. I mean, we have a lot of questions that need analysis, and I think disaster studies has a lot to offer in terms of doing that kind of work. So I hesitate to say it's a good time, because it's not a good time. It's a terrible time. But the kinds of questions that are derived from disaster research, I think, are relevant right now.
Okay. Sounds very terrific for my mind, but hope to things getting better and better. So for the next, this question is about why. Could you tell the story about the reason why you begin the COVIDCalls project for us? Could you introduce it?
Sure. Thanks for asking that question. It's a little odd because I do COVID calls almost every day, but I have not talked very much about why I started the project. So let me just say a little bit about it. In 2017, there were 3 hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast in the United States in a short period of time. There was a moment when you could actually see multiple hurricanes if you were looking at the weather map, multiple hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico moving simultaneously. And one of those hurricanes hit my parents' house.
Oh my
They
God.
were living in Port Aransas, Texas. They had moved to this was their retirement home. They had lived where I grew up in Arlington, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, Texas, where I was born. And I grew up there. They had lived there. And finally, they moved to the coast. This is what had been my mother's dream forever, was to live at the beach. And so they did it, and they moved there in the spring of 2017. And then that summer, Hurricane Harvey landed about a mile away, made landfall about a mile away from their house. Now, they evacuated ahead of time, but maybe the storm surge on their street, I mean, it's sort of terrifying to think, 8 feet of the ocean where it was coming up their street, into their garage, into their house. It did a lot of damage. It shut down that community, and I made a trip to see them and see the damage that had been done, and it was really hard for them, and it was too hard for them, and they couldn't really face staying there and rebuilding. They had just moved there, really, so they sold that place and they moved to San Antonio, where they live now. And I remember, at that time, of course, a lot of emotions, and but I remembered later thinking, I really wished I had done a lot of interviews. I mean, this is the historian talking. So like my impulse is like, well, let's do some interviews. Let's get some of this on the record so that we can understand it and that we can use it later as a way to make sense of what happened here. And I think I had tucked that idea away in the back of my head. There's one other thing, and this comes to the name of the project. So a lot of times, so I'm a historian. I work a lot with old documents, photographs, government reports. I'm very comfortable 100 years in the past. I'm very happy to be reading old documents. But I also am really interested in the ways that the past influences the present. And I frequently, when a disaster strikes, what I will do is make calls, pick up the phone and start calling around, call emergency managers or scientists or journalists, people I know who know things about what's going on with the disaster. And when COVID had already arrived in the United States, but when the lockdown started, which for me was March 16th, 2020, when that started, I was planning that day to make a bunch of calls. I had a bunch of people I was going to call just to find out what they were doing. And then ordinarily I might record those calls and use them later for my own research. But everything was moving on to Zoom. I mean, you all remember that moment where like every part of your life was now transitioning into a Zoom call. And I thought, what if I just did the calls live? What would that be like? And so the first 2 weeks of COVID calls were actually more like webinars. They were like live, and people could tune in and then they could ask questions like they were participants, like a seminar, webinar. And people were listening. And at the end of that 2 weeks, so that they told us, you'll be out of work for 2 weeks. And then in 2 weeks, you'll come back. Remember, everybody, they told us 2 weeks and then you'll be back to normal. And it was pretty obvious that was not going to happen. So at that point, I transitioned it to something more like what we're doing now, which is a conversation with a guest or a couple of guests, and then to live stream those. I brought on board a former student named Bucky Stanton. Bucky's he was a student of mine at Drexel University. Now he's a graduate student at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He's an STS graduate student there, brilliant guy. And he and I had some long talks about like, how does somebody manage a podcast? I had never done a podcast before. And his attitude was, Knowles, send me the tapes. And it was no more complicated than that. So I started sending him the daily broadcasts, and he still does the daily editing, puts music on, edits it, and then posts that to various podcasting channels. And then I discovered StreamYard, which we're using now, which simultaneously streams it to Facebook and Twitter and Twitch also. So I thought I would do 100 and then stop in the summer of 2020. And but what happened is that the pandemic changed. And the realities of the pandemic in the spring of 2020 were different realities by the summer of 2020. And there was a lull, and then the cases started to pick up again in that late summer. And I said, well, I shouldn't stop doing this now. There's new information. And that has happened every time I've set a deadline that I thought I would stop doing this project. I kept doing it. I had also the help of Shivani Patel, who's a current student at Drexel University. So she joined the project and started she does the booking. So she helps me. A lot of times I spend hours reading every day COVID materials, and I'll I'll take a screenshot of something off Twitter and I'll just email it to her, and the subject line might be, "I'd like to talk," and she will get the guests, and her attitude is one that we should all emulate, which is that if somebody says no to her, she always writes back and says, "Thank you, and we'll ask you again in a couple of months when you have more time." So she's worked very hard for the project as well. So there's more to say about it, but that's how it started. That's how it's developed, and
That's how's going on.
Yeah.
Wow. So the project is actually starts with very small case, but it's now getting bigger situation. I guess so. So I hope I hope the COVID call should be done as soon as possible due to the end of the pandemic situation, because of the end of the pandemic situation.
Yeah.
But until the end, I think you have to keep tracing and keep making all the videos, all the tests for everyone. So I think the time we allowed is not too much. So I'll just ask for our last question. So for the future, is there any direction you'd like COVID call to move forward? I think it is actually, in this situation, you're broadcasting on several podcasts and also taping and making various way to whatever you have to do, whatever you can do. But is there any your plan or making much better and a lot more of people could watch your COVID calls?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a few things I would like to have happen with COVID calls. One is I would like to, and this is a plan going into the new year, is that the emphasis, which has been still, even though I've moved to South Korea, the emphasis still continues to be a lot in North America. And so as I move into 2022, the emphasis will shift to parts of the world that have not had as many episodes. So discussions, Latin America and Africa particularly, are areas where there'll be more guests coming from those. The other thing that I'm excited to announce is that pretty soon we will start inviting researchers to use the archive. So the website with every episode, audio, video, and transcript will launch this month. And that means you could go to one place and search by keyword. All of the transcripts will be there. It's a phenomenal undertaking. It's been led by Eleanor Mays, who's a graduate student at Berkeley in the United States, with the help of many other people. So that's going to be, and what I would like to see happen is researchers to start using it as a research tool. So those are the big ambitions as we go into the next year. And I guess the other thing I will hope is that this comes back to what Junha was reading before, talking about the problem of losing sight of COVID because of the numbers. We're overwhelmed with numbers, and humans don't do good with big numbers. They don't. After a while, we numb out to those. I'd like COVID calls to be an instrument of memorialization. I have such enormous respect for people like Alex Goldstein, Kristen Urquiza. They have been leading memorial efforts in the United States, and I'd like COVID calls to actually become part of the movement for justice coming out of COVID, and that means memorialization. So, as always, I'm interested anyone who wants to participate and to help with that. And but this COVID calls will be one tiny little attempt of a much bigger effort to understand what's happened to us and how we can sort of learn something meaningful from this time so that we don't face this kind of devastation again.
Okay, thanks for your answering all of our questions. So I think our part is done, and from now it's time to Professor going to ask some question for us.
Okay, great. I always feel more comfortable when I'm behind the mic than when I'm answering questions. There's one other thing I just want to kind of get this on the record, if it's okay. And I forgot to mention this early in the COVID calls. my kids were also doing school at home during that time. And my wife, who's a genius, very early when the pandemic broke out, she bought a ping pong table. And so an average day at my house was everybody gets up, has breakfast, goes to their own private rooms where they're doing school and work. Our house got turned into a WeWork station, just like everybody else's house. We were lucky that no one got sick. Nobody had to be an essential worker, so we had that. And then occasionally somebody would yell upstairs, "Ping pong!" And you run outside, and in the garage, the ping pong table would be set up, and we had these fierce ping pong matches. And then at 5 o'clock, it would be time for COVID calls. And my son, Gabriel, my oldest son, he was the sound engineer for those first 100 episodes. So he was listening, sitting in the same room with me and listening. And I would always ask him if the sound levels were good. And then we would chat over dinner about what happened with the COVID calls. So I meant to say that earlier, but that's such a strong memory for me of that early period of the pandemic, that it was such a terrible time, but it was also such a powerful time of togetherness for my family. And the memory is complicated in that way. So maybe with that, I'll just transition and let me, Jaehoon, let me ask you first, if you wouldn't mind sharing a memory of your COVID experience.
My personal experience during COVID situation, right?
Yes.
Let me think. Any special events? Oh, it's not my personal. I've heard the news from somebody else, my friend. In the early period last year, I think it's like May or June, those periods. I saw news that some or one woman or girl with similar to my age, and her mother tripped to Jeju Island and spread all those viruses in those islands and came back by airplane to Seoul. And that time they doesn't answer for any question by the government about those spreading viruses or something. And so the people are all shocked because they have no information in also in the Jeju Island, and also in the people float with together by airplane, and also in Seoul nearby their house. And I found out that I met her, I know her, and I know her face, and like I had a talk several times, and I was very shocked that those those actions are very bad things for all nations, because they cover up those useful informations to prevent spreading COVID viruses, but they just shut their mouth and do nothing. And after that happened, so many people got COVID inside Jeju Island, and they also blocked several airplanes. That was very that event was very shock for me.
It's I mean, it must have been shocking to see. I mean, you all were experiencing the realities of COVID before anyone in the West. And to see episodes like that, I mean, it must have felt, I don't know. I mean, were you afraid, or what were your emotions at that time, Jaehoon?
Also similar experience had in nearby my hometown. People from church, they just go inside and pray without mask, and they spread those viruses. And also they doesn't say anything to the government. So I was just in the event in Jeju. I was just shocked and why they're doing such things. They're such a bad actions for our all nations and their families or their friends, all the people. And after uh, the church event nearby my hometown happened, I was very afraid and like never went out almost 2 weeks. Like beginning with that time, my hometown people got so much viruses those times. So uh, it was very afraid period for me. That was the very hard time, the most hard time here by those COVID period.
That incident with the church was in Daegu?
No. Daegu event was the biggest one, the most popular one. But some small events happen all around
I see.
South Korea. Yeah, right.
I see. Okay. Junha, let me ask you the same question about sharing a personal memory of the COVID time. What sticks in your memory?
Well, COVID-19 gives very shocked memory to me because, well, I was the freshman last year. So it changed my kind of university life very unexpectedly. Because luckily I was held the graduating ceremony because it was held in January. So after I finished the graduating ceremony and have a trip to the Taiwan, and when that trip ends, then this kind of COVID-19 situation in Korea started. At the time that I was thinking like, oh, it has been a few months to wait, then and everything will be okay. And that was my first impression of the kind of COVID-19 virus, but it wasn't at all. So admission to get into the university dormitory has been disappeared at the end of the February, and I've got we're gonna start this semester a bit later, and I was like, oh, I can go to this school at least at the May or June in worst case, but that wasn't happened. And the first time to the school after the admission event was that this year, so I was never been to the KAIST last year, 2020. So how can I never imagined that I could be the sophomore who do not know everything in the school, know not everything about geography. I don't know where is MPO and where is W2 and something just like this. I don't know where is bank, where is restaurant, or I don't know anything before this year. So I think this is the most thing that affected, and I would be like to meet lots of people when I come to the KAIST, but it wasn't come true at last year, and still people are just staying in their home. So I think it's kind of this is the thing that COVID-19 affected my life.
When did you first set foot on KAIST campus?
Well, after admission, and I think it's April of 2021.
Of this year? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I think for people who may not be as familiar with South Korean higher education, and the students are too humble to say so, but to get accepted to KAIST is a big deal. And that first year, everybody who's privileged enough to go to college knows what it's like to show up in that first week and your parents say goodbye and there's a tearful goodbye, and then it's the exhilaration. And you must have that in your mind, you must have been ready for that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And then next thing you know, you're back home.
Yeah.
Or you're still
About
at home.
that, some of students with my sophomores have never been to KAIST yet. I've heard that. Not me, but it's so sad.
Yeah. Well, what about your family, Junha? Did it affect your family at all?
Yeah, because my family is in abroad right now. My parents are in Canada. So I think if there wasn't COVID-19 situation, I would be like to go there following them. But as you know, I cannot do anything like going to trip in Canada or the exchange students are most that canceled, and so that I still remaining in Korea, so which separates my family. That's the other thing. It's very sad.
When did they move to Canada
This year,
this year?
about April. Yeah, April. As I remember.
I see. Thank you for sharing those memories. Sung-chan, same question to you, which you've asked me, but now I ask you. Share a memory.
So while I'm listening to Juna's story, I remember some of unique experience due to the COVID-19. I never talked it before with anyone. So actually, I finished my military service in Korea at the 2020 in January 15. Actually, it was the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. So at that time, only the China was the serious situation, and the people around the world now getting, is it really serious problem? They are now getting, it is really serious, and they now just beginning wondering the problem. And the late of January, I traveled to the Moscow in the Russia. So I traveled to the Russia in the January 29 and until the February 8th, about 10 days with the college friends. So it was first time that I have visited Russia, and there was very lot of Chinese traveler also. And most of the Western people they feel hard to distinguish between Korean and Chinese. So a lot of Russians just think us as like a Chinese. So actually, it was a little bit hard to travel for us. And at the time, the wearing mask culture is not really widespread in the time. So someone's are taking the mask and someone was not. Actually, I was the people who didn't really want to take the mask. And also my friend, he was really want to take mask. So we just opposite sides. So and usually at Russia at the time, nobody was wearing mask. Only my friend wearing the mask. So a lot of people looking at us, why they wearing the mask? So the time that I can travel to Russia is very lucky because after a week, all airplane lines are canceled. Nobody can move from the flight line. So it was very lucky and unique experience that can have a travel before the pandemic became the overall world. Yeah, it was very interesting actually.
So Junha got to go to Taiwan. You were in Russia. I'm coming from the US. All these travels right before. Jaehoon, where were
I
you?
just stayed in Korea.
If you had known now if you'd known then what you know now, you would have been booking a flight in December, huh?
Maybe not. I want to go like abroad. I was planning to go like after the semester ends because the with Corona system has been started.
Right.
But like I infected like 7,000 yesterday, so
yeah,
I'm afraid a little bit.
And it's very hard right now. I mean,
right.
My wife and older son, were going to go because he's been vaccinated. They were going to go to Singapore because Singapore and Korea have managed the pandemic very well, and they have a special travel relationship. But as you say, the numbers in the last 2 weeks, and Singapore has gone through something very similar, are startling. For me, coming from the United States, the numbers in Korea for the whole country of 52 million people are what we're seeing in the United States in like medium-sized towns. But it's the context within Korea because it's been so managed. It's alarming when you see the change so rapidly. Jaehoon, let me stay with you and ask you a question about how you perceive the government response to COVID in Korea. The government has taken a lot of credit for its response, and I don't think it's uncalled for or unwarranted. I don't mean to be critical of that, but it has become sort of part of a narrative around Korea's ability to manage disasters. And I wonder what you think about that as a young person and a future leader in Korea. Is this something like, do you think the government has managed it well? What would you see done differently?
So for the overall management in like 2 years or such points at overall things.
Mm-hmm.
I think like all over the world, all over world, people are saying our country had been blocked COVID well, and that's kind of true compared to other Western countries, US, America, Singapore, and New Zealand, and Korea. Those three countries are the most. Well, the country had been blocked COVID well, but like, however, we can't be satisfied at all. Like, we can't satisfy all of the things. We always point out some disadvantages and some bad points. And nowadays, those infections have been increased to 7,000, and those people, most of those people are young children, between 12 to 17. Those students, and why those students get affected, because parents don't want to actually get vaccine to their children because of the dangerous things like the side effects of the vaccine. But actually today, like 3 p.m., like 4 hours ago, government briefed to suggest get vaccine for young children. It's okay, better than older people, less side effects. And those like getting vaccinated, lots of people, those management have been succeeded well, very well. Like the vote did the best way. I think it was the best way to prevent those COVID situation. That point will I think it's the best point. Our country did well.
I think you've shined a light on a really important and interesting point there, which is that compared to some other countries, Korea was late in getting its vaccination program started. But if you look between July and November of this year, it's extraordinary. I mean, to get to 80% in such a short period of time. But then, as you point out, there's this important age group, which also happens to be the school-going age group in that 12 to 18, where the vaccine uptake, although it's been authorized, has been slow. And so that's an issue that the government's now going to have to really address, and then the 5 to 11-year-old vaccination as well. Junho, let me ask you same question. Anything that you might point to in the way that Koreans and the government or anywhere in Korean society have reacted to the pandemic?
Well, there might be lots of definition of success, and I think Korea has success from the point of view that keeping people safe, kind of very intensive distancing, and it has resulted in very fewer COVID-19 positive cases and deaths. But in terms of our freedom or some like other aspects, then we are very hardly controlled. So we cannot enjoy any life in Korean's kind of policy. So I think that real success or failure will be figured out after this kind of with COVID-19 policy which have been started from the few weeks ago. and we are having some kind of trouble right now, but I still believe that we can handle it out, and I hope so. And it could be done differently, but I never say that it will affect better or not. So in case of keeping people safe, I think it's success, but I think it's time to be different from now on.
It's that's such an interesting point because the death, acceptance of an increasing death rate is different culturally in different countries. I mean, there are almost 800,000 people have died of this pandemic in the United States. And so, I mean, I don't want to say that people are, there are many people who raise the alarm every single day, but it's just become a sort of normal. And it's not been a normal in South Korea. So I think that's an interesting tension you're pointing to is what will happen in the next month or two, and what death rate ultimately is acceptable in exchange for a greater amount of, let's say, freedom of movement, people gathering in larger numbers, those kinds of things. Countries that have pursued a zero COVID attitude, like you were mentioning New Zealand and Australia, I mean, Melbourne was in lockdown for 280 days, I think. Junha, just coming back to you on that, I mean, do you think that Koreans will accept a higher death rate going into the new year if it means being able to have more, sort of, as you say, more freedom and openness? Or no? Do you think we're moving back into a kind of lockdown phase?
I think, in my opinion, yeah, after people are getting vaccinated, then our society might hold it. But I think Koreans now, the medias are very highly checking this kind of numbers every day, and they are just saying that it's so dangerous and we cannot hold it. And so I think media has kind of been very strong, raising issues. So I think a bit afraid of them, but I want to have some kind of corona system is better than before, but I'm not sure that the society might accept it. But I think there are lots of conflicts between them. I can see everywhere that we have to live it like normally before the COVID. And some said that people are more safe is more good. Safe is more important. So people should distance as before 2 years, 2 years before. But I think when people, I don't think that people can accept this kind of highly distancing system forever, and I think that's kind of it became dangerous and more dangerous, and one day it did come up. So I think it's time to change.
I mean, even listening to you describe 2 years, it's just extraordinary when you think about it. Adapting our lives in this way, and even what you've all been describing, normal things, travel, being together with family, first day of school, graduations, everything, just to adapt those and then have no ending point. The psychological toll is tremendous, I think. I just want to remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Junha Yoon and Sukchan Choi and Jaehoon Kim today, and this very special episode in which I got to talk a little bit too, which I really appreciate. We're going to wind up now. I want to sort of one question I'd like to ask each of you as we finish up. Sukchan, I'm going to ask you first this question: is there anything that do you look at the world differently now? Is there anything that you want to know now? If your interests changed, has this episode reshaped who you are in any way, or are you looking forward to with Corona and put this time behind you and get back to the life you were leading before January of 2020?
Hold on a second. The question is too big. Hold on a second. Well.
While you're thinking, let me throw the question to Jaehoon, and then we'll come back to you, because it is a big question. And in disaster studies, it's a question we wrestle with all the time. Do disasters actually change society or not? Are they really moments of continuity, or are they moments in which people fundamentally change who they are in society? changes. It's not fair to ask such big questions, but I am curious to know, because you're all deep thinkers, what you think about it. Jae-hoon, what do you think?
I think the humanity is an animal that can adjust all those situations and being improved well. So if Corona, those pandemic has been end a short moment, then nothing would be changed a lot before those events. But it has been 2 years, and I think it could be go on more. So and like among those situations, so many techniques, the metaverse or the archiving system has been uprised in Korea. Like those medias are focusing on those archiving systems, and also we are students now, so the Zoom system, online class system, has been improved our life to like listen to the classes different in different places. So I think we have to improve our life more with those techniques, using those techniques. And for me, like I've been staying in my home a lot because of COVID, and I was thinking like to think about more personally, like no without any other, for my future life, like having more time with my dream or something. Yeah, I think we all have to change our life happening more. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Sung-chan, what do you think? Just to come back to you on this, and then I'll give Junha the final word.
So, dude, suffering these times, saying nothing changed might be liar. So, what I think the most change in the world now is the law of the jungle is getting stronger than before. For a long time, the human civils are trying to not being as it is jungle, not forced by the power, but so that's why we make the laws, what we make the culture. That's the way how we try to live together. But during these 2 years, the ecosystems are changed. So the law of the jungle getting stronger is the most impact for me.
It's really interesting. You're both describing a lot of change in the way that you look at things, and of course, why wouldn't you? Junha, let me just give you the question and maybe be the final word on this. How COVID has changed you or not, and how maybe, do you see broader changes in society and your own interests in that society somehow shifting over this time, or is just going to be 2 years, you pack it away and move on?
Well, Seung-chan and Jae-hoon told me so great things. They're so broad things. So I just see kind of narrow expectation for me. And so I think I've changed kind of personal experiences, personal interest is a little bit changed. And this is the one of the reason why I'm taking the kind of STP class. Because as I could see in before when I was experiencing COVID-19, then I felt like the science and policy are not very directly engaged together. But after COVID-19 and I'm listening to the variety of STP classes, then I could imagine like science and technology and policies are very closely related, because kind of you might know that everybody will hear about how vaccination works and how the mRNA vaccine and the ordinary vaccines are different, and we all listen to them, even if person who are not interested in science, and how can the quarantine works, and what is the COVID-19 virus, and what is the mutations, and so much like scientific words are coming to the public, then I could see that it is very important to linking up the kind of science and the public, and policies are very important. So I think this is the one thing that I have changed my side through the COVID-19 situation.
Okay. And STP, for those not familiar, is Science and Technology Policy, which is the program that the course that all the students have been taking is engaged in. And I just want to remind everybody you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me at 6 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday, which so we're on Korea time right now, so it's 6:25 p.m. Thursday here. But for those who are on the East Coast, 6 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday, when I talked to Dr. William Lee, who's a specialist in nutrition, and we'll be talking about COVID and nutrition. And I want to thank my guests today, Sung-chan Choi, Jae-hoon Kim, and Junha Yoon, for contributing to this conversation and contributing to this archive, and for really opening up in your own thoughts and your own personal history throughout this time. Thanks to each of you for this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for joining our interview, Professor.
Enjoyed it very much. Stay healthy, everyone, and we'll see you next time on COVID Calls.